Welcome, Ralph, and welcome everyone to our spotlight. We finally changed it's about tax infrastructure, but we wanted to make it a little more interesting, the title. So we are calling it the tax puzzle, how everything fits together or doesn't as it works out. And I first heard Ralph last summer debating Leslie Munger. And he was talking about Adam Smith and Roman roads and all these things. And I thought, what? And then he puts it all together and how that makes sense and explains everything about taxes and how they work together. And also then last fall, we had Elena Kagan from the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs talk to us about the Fair Tax Amendment. So we've got that as our background, which failed. So now we need to know what else is going on, and Ralph is going to help us here. Let me read you a little of his biography. So let me start. Ralph is Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, a bipartisan 501c3 think tank committed to ensuring that state, federal, and local workforce, education, fiscal, economic, and budget policies are fair and just and promote opportunity for all, regardless of race, ethnicity, or income class. During his time at the CTBA, Ralph has helped obtain numerous legislative successes, including passage of the evidence-based model of education, a state-earned income tax credit, corporate accountability legislation, decoupling Illinois tax policy from both the federal bonus depreciation rules and the federal repeal of the estate tax. He's also the Rubloff Professor of Public Policy at Roosevelt University. In addition to his professorship at Roosevelt, he has taught fiscal policy seminars and education finance courses for various universities and the International Fulbright Scholar Program. In 2018, Ralph was appointed to serve on the legislatively established Professional Review Panel, charged with monitoring the implementation of Illinois' new evidence-based school funding formula. He was also appointed to the transition team of Governor-elect J.B. Pritzker. Ralph has received numerous awards for his work on education policy reform, including being named River Forest's Co-Villager of the Year by the Wednesday Journal for his work promoting equity in District 90, the 2007 Champion of Freedom Award presented by the Rainbow Push Coalition. He received the Adlai Stevenson Award for Public Service presented by the American Society for Public Administration to honor one individual with a connection to the Chicago area that has made outstanding contributions to government and public administration over an extended period of time. Ralph is a regular columnist on education, fiscal, and economic policy for the State Journal Register, the Daily Herald, and the News Gazette. He received his BA in history with highest honors from Indiana University and his JD from the University of Michigan. So with that, welcome, Ralph, and go ahead. Should I share my screen?
Yes, share your screen, get that PowerPoint up there, give everyone something to look at much prettier than my face. So I am Ralph Martiri, and I'm Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. And, you know, we're going to talk about the state's fiscal problems today, but I'm going to try to put them in context because you really can't understand tax policy unless you get what's going on in the state's long-term fiscal struggle. So I think to get this working, click out of the protected view, just X that out at the far right. See the yellow on the top there, Beth? That little X, it says enable editing. Just click that X next to that enable editing.
Ah, okay.
And now go to slideshow in the center. Click on slideshow. And from beginning. There you go.
Are we there?
Yes.
Okay, super.
So now if you'll go to the first slide, the first thing I want to talk about is what the state's general fund budget covers. So next slide, please.
Yeah,
There we
next
go.
one.
Yeah, this is perfect. So the state, no, the one we, yeah.
Okay.
Go back one. There we go. So the state of Illinois general fund has $41 billion that they're going to spend this year, as you can see at the very top line here. Now, we break that spending down into two parts so that everyone understands what's really happening with your taxpayer dollars. So if you look at the hard costs at the top, number 2 there, it's 13.8 billion. We call them hard costs because these are things the state has to pay either by law or by contract. So there's debt service to third parties like banks or bondholders. The money comes in, the money goes out. There's pension contribution. That's the subject of a statutory transfer. There's a number of other statutory transfers out, the smaller in amount that go to like little Medicaid funds, et cetera. And then there's group health insurance on state workers. That $13 billion is spent. No one votes on anything. This is just by law. Then you go down to the general fund service appropriations. These are the things that the state has some discretion over. And it's where the state spends your taxpayer money on services. Seems like people are having trouble. See, I guess part of the slide is cut off. So
Is that better?
Make it a little smaller.
Yeah, maybe if you just made it a little smaller, Beth, that would work.
No. Whoa. I don't know how to do this in Zoom.
Do you have a bar at the bottom that you can slide?
You can pinch it. I just pinched it to make it smaller on my screen. But it still needs to get moved over to the left.
Yeah. Well, dang, I don't know. Hide video panel? No. Hide floating meeting controls. Is that better?
No,
Can you see the whole slide?
no.
Because I can see it on my screen. I see the whole slide.
On
but
my
there's-
screen, the left side of the screen is black. It's like the spreadsheet has to be moved over to the left.
Okay, let me, wait a minute. Wait a minute.
I tell you what, I'm gonna just roll on. I'll give you the numbers because I know them pretty well. That's
Wait, we want everyone to see this.
Try control minus. The control key and the minus key and see if that helps.
No. I was going to try to, if I'm not in, if I exit, usually I exit the full screen view, but I can't see it.
Yeah.
Well, this is-
When Beth, when I did view and went to standard, I got it on my whole screen. Up in the right-hand corner, because it says side-by-side speaker, side-by-side gallery, and standard. When I went to standard, I got it all. I don't know if that will help anyone.
I think I have a different screen because, oh shoot.
This is just up in the right-hand corner where the gallery, the view is, and how you're
Yeah,
viewing it.
I know, that's what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
yeah. And if you hit exit full screen, it should.
Yeah,
put
that's what I'm looking
everything
for.
up. It's in that little
Yeah.
view icon up in the top right.
Mhm.
At least it is on my screen.
Right, it is, that's what it is usually on mine, and I think it's, oh, there, okay. No? Ah,
Ralph could fill in what's missing
Yeah, let's just keep going.
part of it.
Yeah,
Let's
let's
go.
go
Okay.
on. If
Yeah.
and so the bottom line is that from that first slide, the big takeaways are pretty simple. State's only going to spend about 27 billion of that 41 billion on current services, and 96 cents out of every dollar the state's going to spend this year are going to go to four things: education, healthcare, social services, and public safety. That's really where our taxpayer money gets spent. And the state of Illinois right now can't afford its current level of expenditures on those four core service areas. And education, of course, includes everything from early childhood to K-12 and higher ed. But the bottom line is these are core services. They're needed across the state. Illinois is only spending $27 billion on those items, which may sound like a lot. We have the sixth largest population and the fifth largest economy of any state. Our spending compared to other states ranks in the bottom third to the bottom 25 percentile on each of these service categories. So we're a very low spending state, and we can't afford our current level of expenditures. Next slide, please. Now, this is a quick walk down of why we can't afford or where we are in our deficit situation. So if you go to the top line there, what you see is we're projected to have $41.7 billion in tax revenue this year. That's the top line. And out of that, we have to pay those hard costs, the things over which there's no discretion that are required to be paid by law or contract, of 13.8 billion. So you take that out, that leaves 27.8 billion in revenue. That's the second line. But then we also have a deficit carry forward from last fiscal year, which is projected to be about 8.3 billion. The deficit carry forward is just unpaid bills. But they got to pay that with this year's revenue, because by state law, you have to pay any bills left over from the prior year before the end of the next fiscal year. So that 8.3 billion becomes a charge on current revenue, leaving only 19.4 billion in revenue to cover current services this year. The state's going to spend 27 billion on current services, meaning our deficit remains just about $8.3 billion. Or, and you don't see this on the screen, but I can tell you that's roughly 30% of everything the state of Illinois is budgeted to spend on education, health, social services, and public safety this year is deficit spending. Next slide, please. The reason we got here is the state of Illinois has a structural deficit. And so what you see is dollar amounts up and down the north-south axis there on the left-hand side. What you don't see on this screen are the fiscal years. So it starts with fiscal year 2019 in the far left-hand corner. And this is just a comparison of how the state's costs are going to grow over the next 30 years or 10 years compared to its revenue. The top line, the light yellowy greeny line, is the cost line, and the red line is the revenue. Now, this is assuming the state of Illinois starts with a balanced budget. It does not have a balanced budget. As you now know, it has an accumulated deficit of over 8 billion. But even if it started with a balanced budget and its revenues were honestly matching its expenditures, if you just adjust for historic rates of inflation and changes in population, you assume a normal economy, no COVID-19 recession or anything like it, our revenue growth will be significantly less than the cost of maintaining current services. This is actually a crucial slide. This structural imbalance, it can only be caused by one of two things: either out of control spending on services or flawed tax policy. What we're going to talk about today. The giveaway, of course, is it is caused by flawed tax policy. And I'm going to show you the data that backs that up. But we've had a structural deficit like this in the state of Illinois for decades now, going back to at least the early 1970s. That's the first time the University of Illinois identified the state as having a structural deficit. So what politicians in both parties have done to conceal this structural deficit from taxpayers and voters are really three things. Number one, they've cut spending on services over time gradually, right? But when the state is spending over 95% of every taxpayer dollar on education, health, social services, and public safety, it really doesn't want to just slash those in any given year, because that's politically very unpopular. The second thing it's done is push the primary obligation for paying for K-12 education away from the state and down to local property taxes. This is in fact why property taxes are high. And Illinois has done that more than any other state. I'm going to show that in a slide or two. And the third thing it did to hide the structural deficit, and this is all because politicians didn't want to deal with tax policy. The third thing it did was intentionally underfund the pensions. So the actuary said, hey, to fund the benefits being earned this year in your 5 public employee pension systems, you need to put in X dollars. They said, yeah, we know that's the responsible thing to do, but we're going to put in significantly less than X dollars. We're going to write an IOU to the pension system that'll bear interest annually that compounds. And instead of putting the money into the pensions like we should have, we're going to use it to hide a portion of the structural deficit and literally borrow to spend on services. And so that's how they maintain some service expenditures over time. So next slide, please. So how do we know? Oh boy, this is a beautiful slide and you're missing it. So I'm going to give you some of the numbers. So how do we know that spending did not cause the problem? Well, this is a comparison between expenditures this year that are budgeted for fiscal year 2022, which is going to start in July of this year, versus fiscal year 2000, 2 decades ago, under Governor Jim Ryan. So just so you could follow, and you can see some of the numbers here, I'll fill you in on the bottom line. In the far left-hand column there, what you see is the actual expense in fiscal year 2000 under Republican Governor George Ryan. The very next column is that number adjusted into today's dollars. So after inflation, if you wanted to just be making the same investment you were making back in 2000, you would have to be, for the item in question, you'd have to be making the investment in the second column. So if for education, for instance, $4.6 billion expenditure in the year 2000 is the equivalent to $8.3 billion expenditure today. The third column is what the proposed budget actually is. And then the fourth column is the differential. And there's actually a fifth column that shows you the differential on a percentage basis. And when you scroll through this, what you see is absolutely every public service in Illinois has been cut in real inflation adjusted terms over the last 20 years, except for early childhood. But the bottom line is we're spending 22.8% less on current services today after you adjust for inflation than we did in the year 2000. Spending has never been the cause of our fiscal problems, and all the data support that. And I think this is a very powerful slide. And for those of you that can't see the whole slide, I will be happy to share this slide with your group, the whole PowerPoint presentation, so that you can have it in a PDF form. You could all see all these things. And don't worry about taking copious notes. Not that you would take copious notes of anything I say, but if you were so motivated, please don't. I will share this whole PowerPoint presentation with you. And even the one area of increase, early childhood, it's great that that's up by $239 million over 2 decades. That's a 78% increase. That would be your good news. Your bad news is the actual demand for early childhood services in Illinois exceeds $3 billion. We're only budgeting $544 million for that item this year. So while we've made a significant enhanced investment, even there, we are significantly underfunding it. Next slide, please. How about revenue? Is that the problem? Well, what you don't see here is that revenue today in the state of Illinois, which would be the very far right-hand column, on an inflation-adjusted basis is exactly where it was in the year 2000. Next slide, please. Now, what's interesting about that is we've actually increased taxes over these periods. The tax rate, let's say just for the income tax rate back in the year 2000 was only 3% for individuals. It's now 4.95%. If we hadn't made that increase, revenue would be significantly lower this year by like 7 or 8 billion than what it was 2 decades ago after you adjust for inflation. Illinois never has had a spending problem. We've always had a revenue problem. It has created this structural deficit. Now, I did say that one of the things the state has done politically to hide that structural deficit is borrow against the pensions and use that money to cover the structural deficit, pay for some services, and then say, we'll pay you back pension system. Well, the plan to pay the pension systems back was actually passed into law back in 1995, and it's called the pension ramp. You've all heard about the pension ramp, passed under Governor Edgar speaker at the time, he's been retired for a while now, is a guy named Mike Madigan. You may have heard of him. But anyway, they agreed on this pension ramp, and it was a 50-year plan. So from the year 1995 to 2045, to pay back what has been borrowed from the pension systems. Now, what's interesting about that plan was it created sort of a new payment obligation for the state. Hey, we're going to pay back what we've borrowed. We have the structured plan for doing it, but they didn't pass a nickel of tax revenue to fund it. How do you create a new payment obligation when you already have a structural deficit and not pass revenue to fund it? All that does is it makes your structural deficit worse, and it did. And what you can see a little bit from this graphic that's in front of you, if you add the two bars together, see there's a little pink bar and there's a blue bar. That's the contribution that has to be made under the pension ramp law that was passed in 1995 in a single year. Those two colors added together. But I broke them out into their different component parts to just show you how much of this is not driven by benefits. So that little pink bar, that's the cost of funding the benefits being earned. The blue bar, that giant blue bar that is growing, you see how much that grows over time. That's the plan for repaying the debt. This is why it's called a ramp. It's ridiculously backloaded, and it grows at rates that are just unaffordable. So between fiscal year 2020 and 2021, last year, for instance, the pension ramp, just the debt service part of this, grew by over $550 million. Our total revenue growth from all taxes over that same period was under 200 million. So you could see this repayment plan is something other than responsible, and it really has to be done away with if we're going to solve the state's fiscal problem. So we're going to get into tax policy in a second and how we should change our tax policy to make it work in the modern economy, but we clearly have to deal with this pension ramp. Next slide, please. And so the way to do that is to re-amortize the pension debt. So this red line that you see going across the graphic here, that's the current pension ramp. Those are just the total payments that you have to be made. You can see how they grow to almost reach $20 billion by the year 2045 in a single year. It's north of $9 billion this year. What we say is refinance that debt, put a little bit more money in up front now, and then flatten out the payment. And this will get the systems healthy, save taxpayers $45 billion. Now, since we don't have the tax revenue to cover the repayment plan, and the new repayment plan would be these lighter green, blue bars, the very light colored bars, that's the new total payment that would have to go to the pension systems. The way we get the money to put in that additional investment up front, that dark green that you see there, is through pension obligation bonds. And all the bond proceeds go into the pension systems, creating an asset for the systems that then generates a return over time. And the light blue bars repay those bonds and get the pension systems healthy. So this is just a rational way to refinance our debt, save $45 billion in taxpayer money, and deal with one of the drivers of our fiscal problems today that was actually created by bad tax policy. The structural deficit encouraged politicians in both parties who didn't want to deal with taxes to underfund the pensions and divert that revenue to cover current services. So now we're saying, let's come up with a rational repayment plan, save taxpayers money, take this long-term pressure off the system. But that doesn't solve all our problems. We're also going to have to get into dealing with the state's tax policy as well. Next slide, and just skip over this one, the next slide, and go to the next slide. Next slide.
Just one more.
Yeah. So what taxes are, well, there you go. What taxes are available and how should we balance them? These are the 5 main taxes that really are available to fund services for state and local governments. You have income taxes, sales taxes, excise taxes, property taxes, and users fees. You all know what an income tax is. And if you picked up a tax policy book, and I do teach a master's course on this at Roosevelt University, and I expect at least 5 or 6 of you to enroll in that course next semester. So I'm looking forward to you all joining me at Roosevelt. It's a great place. But the job of the income tax is to create fairness in your tax system among taxpayers with different abilities to pay. And it also has the job of responding to the modern economy. Sales taxes are supposed to generate stable revenue even during down economic environments. an excise tax and a sales tax are slightly different from each other. A sales tax is more based on the economy. It's a percentage of the price of whatever you're buying. So if you buy in Illinois a clock, you pay a sales tax on that clock. And as the price of clocks go up over time, sales tax automatically goes up over time, the amount of revenue it generates, right? Because the sales tax is based on the price of the item you're serving. An excise tax, similar to sales tax, but it isn't based on price, it's based on a unit. So think about it's a certain dollar amount or tax levy per gallon of gas, per liter of alcohol, per pack of cigarettes. The problem with excise taxes, while they generate a little bit of money, is they don't grow with the economy over time. Because let's say it's $1 per pack of cigarettes in 1990, and it's still $1 per pack of cigarettes in the year 2000. Well, over that 10 years after inflation, that dollar per pack has lost pretty much 30 or 40% of its value. In real terms, it's only worth, so let's say 65, 70 cents. So excise taxes don't grow with the economy. Sales taxes do. The two main taxes for state government are income and sales. And any solution of the state's tax policy problem has to come with dealing with those two main taxes. Property taxes are very stable taxes, but they're only available to local governments. 49 of the 50 states do not really collect any property tax revenue. One state does. And then there's users fees. And this is things like your driver's license fee, for instance, or for those of you who are hunters, when you get your hunter's license, etc. And these are just supposed to be used to reimburse government for the actual cost of providing the services. In Illinois, by constitution, they're not supposed to generate additional revenue that can cover other things. And there have been constitutional challenges over time to the sort of amount of user fees being levied to make sure that they stay within these constitutional restrictions. So the bottom line is state government really has the income and sales tax to fund core services. Local government mostly relies on a combination of property taxes and sales taxes. Next slide, please.
Go back to the little guy.
Yeah, no, you went back the wrong way, I think. So next slide, just go next slide. So here you go, fair, responsive, stable, efficient. These are the principles that a capitalist tax system should have. I already told you which taxes play which role. So the income tax is supposed to be fair and responsive. The sales tax is stable and responsive. Efficiency is handled by not over relying on any one tax or another and distorting markets. So go to the next slide, please. How do you have fairness in a capitalist tax system? Oh, you can't see my great Adam Smith quote, Beth. I'm horrified. So I do know this quote by heart. So why not go to the gentleman who invented capitalism to get an understanding of what fair taxation means in a capitalist economy? Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, and it was published in that great year of 1776. Yes, capitalism and America were born together. Sort of meant to be, right? There's a marriage made in heaven. So according to Adam Smith, and this is just straight out of The Wealth of Nations, the subjects of every state ought to contribute toward the support of the government as nearly as possible in proportion to their respective abilities. That is, in proportion to the revenue which they respectively enjoy under the protection of the state. As Henry Home Lord Keynes has written, a goal of taxation should be to remedy inequality of riches as much as possible by relieving the poor and burdening the rich. That is not Karl Marx. That is not socialism. That is the guy that invented capitalism, Adam Smith. Now, why did he come up with this as the design of fair taxation in a capitalist economy? And the answer is actually pretty simple. He felt that because of disproportionate bargaining power, low and middle income laborers would always earn less than the people at the top, disproportionately less than even the value of their input. And the reason for that is bargaining power. So people at the top of the income ladder would get a disproportionate share of economic growth, income growth over time because they had this superior bargaining power. So he said, because in a capitalist economy, that will always happen in your private sector, your public sector ought to respond to that reality and create some fairness by focusing your taxes on those individuals at the top of the income ladder who are going to get this disproportionate share of income growth over time. So that theory is very much testable in data. Do the data bear out what Adam Smith thought would happen? Next slide, please.
Sorry, I don't know.
That's
what
okay.
happened.
And so the answer is yes. So on an inflation adjusted basis, between 1947, the end of World War II, and 1979, the wealthiest 10% in America got 34% of all the growth in income, while the bottom 90% got 66%. Now, these were still good times. Every income class was seeing real growth after inflation in their income every single year on a year-to-year basis. So real growth in purchasing power, real improvement in standard of living. Next slide. There you go. Things have changed. Between 1979 and 2015, and so we left out, the most recent recessionary period from the data set, the wealthiest 10% got 108% of all the growth in income after inflation. So for those of you who hate math, I will point out 100% would have been all of it. So if more than all the inflation adjusted growth in income went to the wealthiest 10%, that literally means 90% of the country was earning less at the end of the sequence than they had before. So Adam Smith was not only right, he'd be a little surprised at how dramatic the worsening of income inequality has become over time nationally in this country. Next slide, please. And we see similar data in Illinois. So what you don't see on this slide is the comparison on the far left there looks at the incomes of the wealthiest 1% in our state. This is Illinois specific data. In 1979, that's the red bar, compared to where it grew to in 2017 on an inflation adjusted basis. So for the richest 1%, their average incomes went from just over $400,000 a year to over $1.4 million a year during this sequence. That's a growth of 254%. On the far right, you see the comparison for the bottom 99% in Illinois. Their incomes grew from an average of $51,000 to $61,000 over this period. So yeah, most of the growth in income went to the top. And so if you had a fair tax system, you'd recognize this and focus your taxes at the top, not the bottom and the middle. But now here's the challenge. The only tax that could do that is the income tax. Every other tax and fee available to state or local government is regressive, as in it will take more of the income of a low or moderate earner than of an affluent earner on an annual basis. And that's because if you think about it, in a sales tax situation, excise tax situation, the people with very different earnings pay the exact same amount of tax on the same purchase. So if somebody earning $10,000 a year buys a lawnmower and pays $50 in taxes on that lawnmower, and a millionaire buys that lawnmower, millionaire is going to pay $50 in taxes on that lawnmower. Obviously, $50 is a greater share of the income of the person earning $10,000 than it is of the person earning $1 million. So every other tax operates that way. The only tax that could actually adjust to ability to pay is the income tax, but then only if it has a graduated rate structure, where it assesses higher rates on higher levels of income and lower rates on lower levels of income. You may have heard of the Fair Tax Amendment. That's exactly what they tried to do. The Illinois Constitution currently requires that the income tax be assessed at one flat rate across all levels of income. This literally runs contrary to fundamental tax policy if you picked up a tax policy book, and to fundamental capitalist tax policy. So next time someone tells you a flat tax is a fair tax, call them a communist, because it is absolutely not the way capitalist tax policy should work. Next slide, please. And this is you could skip this. Next slide, please. That was just a point of emphasis. I'm trying to save time. Next slide. So how does Illinois stack up in its tax policy? The answer is poorly. There you go. So property taxes, let's start here, the local property tax. It's very high in Illinois compared to the rest of the nation. Look at this graphic. This is total property tax collection, state and local, because there is one state that assesses some state property taxes. State and local collections on a per capita basis. Look how Illinois is way above the national average. And next slide, please. That's a bad thing to do for taxpayers for one simple reason. If you can't see this whole graphic, that orange bar shows you that between 1990 and 2018, property taxes in Illinois, after inflation, grew by almost 70%. That's how much property taxes grew in our state. The yellow bar shows you that median income in Illinois only grew by 11% over the same period of time. So property taxes are growing at about 6 to 7 times the rate of growth of income for most people in the state. So that's a very tough burden for people on fixed incomes to pay, or low middle income workers who, as you now know, on an inflation adjusted basis are earning less over time. We have this very, very high property tax burden in Illinois at the local level. Next slide, please. It's also bad for businesses. So this identifies, this is a study done by Ernst & Young, the accounting firm, and it identifies the portion of total business tax burden in Illinois. This is Illinois specific data that comes from the different taxes. Go to the far left there. Property taxes account for 46% of all the taxes businesses pay in our state. There's nothing that comes close. If you go to the middle of this slide, the corporate income tax is only 4% of corporate tax burden. So this over-reliance on property taxes is bad for people. It's bad for businesses. And next slide. The reason we do this is because of education. Illinois ranks 50th out of the 50 states in the portion of education funding covered by state taxes versus local revenue. So the state only pays for 24% of the cost of public education from state-based taxes, whereas we cover 67% of the cost of public education from local property taxes. Next slide, please. This just shows you how out of whack Illinois is compared to the nation. So Illinois is in the red and the rest of the nation on average in the blue. So on the far left, what you see is local property taxes on average in a state, the blue bar, cover 45% of the cost of public education. In Illinois, it covers 67%. Now go to the middle comparison. State taxes, like from the income and sales, on average, the blue bar, cover 46% of the cost of public education. In Illinois, they only cover 24%. We are literally 50th in the nation in the portion of public education paid for by state level taxes, and first in reliance on property taxes. So this is why your property taxes are high. Now, why did we get to this point? Illinois has a structural deficit. Our tax revenue doesn't grow with the economy over time. It doesn't even grow at the same level that it could support the same level of services over time. So what has happened? Well, I told you one of the things the state did was push the primary obligation of fund schools down to the local level. They did it in an incredibly aggressive fashion over time. And so now Illinois is the outlier, ranking first on property taxes to fund schools and dead last in property taxes, in state taxes. Next slide. Now, this one you may be able to see just because of the design, not all of it, that's okay. So we did mention, and Beth mentioned that I helped get the evidence-based funding formula passed. I actually co-authored that legislation with a guy named Mike Jacoby. And it ties education funding in Illinois to covering the cost of those items the evidence indicates actually enhance student achievement over time. And that's it. So it just funds what works. And as it stands today, Illinois is about $6.7 billion short of funding K-12 education to the point where it has everything the evidence indicates it needs. No, it doesn't include pension debt, because debt, that's a whole separate item And that debt item is covered in that pension ramp you saw before. That's just a debt item the state has to pay. And once again, that pension problem exists also because of the structural deficit where the state borrowed aggressively against its pension systems by underfunding the required contribution in and taking that money that should have gone to fund the contribution and instead go to hiding the structural deficit and paying for services. So the bottom line is the state of Illinois has got to put significantly more into K-12 education, and all that revenue should come from state taxes, not from property taxes. We're already way over rely on property taxes. Next slide, please. This just shows you that 83% of our school districts in Illinois have less resources than what the evidence indicates they need, 83%. So it's really important to solve this education funding problem because the vast majority of our schools do not have the capacity to provide their children with a meaningful educational opportunity. Next slide. It's also important from a racial justice standpoint. Now, you're not going to be able to see the bottom lines here. So what we could do with the evidence-based funding formula is see what the per pupil shortfall is for your typical kid attending an underfunded school. On the far left-hand corner there, and I don't even know what color to call it, kind of a pale red? I don't know, but the far left-hand corner, the average white student in Illinois attending an underfunded school is looking at a per pupil funding gap of $3,500. The next line, the average Black student attending an underfunded school is looking at a per pupil gap that's significantly greater, $4,900 per kid. The third bar, which is kind of a pinky purple bar, the average Latinx student is facing a funding gap similar to a Black student of $4,900 per kid, and then the statewide average in blue of $4,200. So what we see is our over-reliance on property taxes to fund schools and the funding gaps created by the state underinvesting has not only disadvantaged low-income children generally, but has singled out Black and brown children specifically for disadvantage. So you'd really want to counter that. And the evidence-based funding formula, next slide, please, has been doing this. So this is the amount of new money that's gone into the EBF since it was passed in the year 2017, fiscal year 2018. And you could see that tier 1 schools, those schools that are furthest away from having an adequate amount of resources, tier 4 schools have more than what they need. Tier 1 schools are really suffering and have very few resources. They've received the lion's share of the new money, 874 million of the 960 million that's gone in has gone to these tier 1 schools that need it most. Next slide. That's really good because 89% of this funding is going to schools that educate 75% of our Black and 71% of our Latino kids. So the good news is the model works, and it's putting the money to redress past structural racism and inequities in our school funding system very effectively. The problem is it's woefully underfunded, and we can't fund it with our current structural imbalance between our revenue growth and our cost growth for maintaining the same level of services, much less getting that extra almost $7 billion into K-12 education. So next slide. And you could, now we're going to get into tax policy itself really quickly. So Illinois does have a relatively high tax rate for its sales tax when compared to other states. And this is the blended state and local rate. So let's just talk about that for a second. So the state of Illinois sales tax rate is 5%. And then local governments automatically add on 1.25%. So no matter where you go in Illinois, the sales tax you pay is at least 6.25%. However, certain home rule counties and other districts have tacked on to the sales tax rate. So like in the city of Chicago, you're going to pay a sales tax rate north of 10%. On a weighted basis, overall, the average rate across the state of Illinois is about 8.7%, which is relatively high. The problem with our sales tax, next slide, is that it doesn't generate nearly enough revenue despite having a relatively high rate. The state rate itself of 5% is actually low. The local government add-ons make it a little high. And you could see Illinois is collecting significantly less per capita from its sales tax than other states, despite having this high rate. Now, why would that be? And the next slide is the reason why. Illinois is not even on your map here. We're the far, far right. We fell off the map on your slide. So this is showing you the far left is Iowa. Iowa taxes 93 service industries. Wisconsin, the next bar, taxes 76. Kentucky, 26. Missouri, 26. Michigan, 23. Indiana, 23. And what you don't see is Illinois. Illinois only taxes 5. So Illinois only taxes 5 of the service industries you can tax with the sales tax. That's a really bad idea because, next slide, please. Services are the largest and fastest growing segment of our economy. So what Illinois does tax is that red bar at the bottom, the sale of products, hard physical things you can touch, clothes, desks, clocks, cell phones, all these kinds of physical things you can touch. What we don't tax are services, haircuts, lawn care, auto repair, labor charges, lawn services, beauty shops, all that stuff we don't tax. Well, that's a problem because the yellow bar is the growth in the service industry as a percentage of our economy in Illinois over time. So by 2016, services made up over 73% of all economic activity in Illinois. And that's what we don't tax. What we do tax, the sale of goods, products, is only about 17% of our economy today. Next slide, please. So one thing we need to do to get our tax policy to work in the modern economy is expand our sales tax base to include consumer services only. If we just tax those consumer services that are already taxed in Iowa and Wisconsin, that'll generate $2 billion in revenue that will grow with our economy over time. Local governments will benefit automatically, like the city of Chicago or really any local government across the state, because their sales tax base piggybacks on the state's base. So when we expand it at the state level, they get to expand it and they will generate more revenue too. This is really crucial. Now, I'm going to highlight that it should only be consumer services. You shouldn't tax business to business services. That creates tax pyramiding. You end up taxing the same transaction more than once as it flows through the economy. Rod Blagojevich suggested doing that when he was governor with his gross receipts tax. And my organization and me personally testified against that as very bad tax policy. So you don't want to tax business to business or financial or healthcare services, literally just things like haircuts and lawn care. And they already tax all those things in Iowa and Wisconsin. And I know people say, well, people will leave the state to go get their services everywhere, elsewhere if we start taxing services. Well, where are they going to go, number one? And they've been taxing things like haircuts in Iowa and Wisconsin for generations. Do you see busloads of people from Iowa and Wisconsin coming here to get their haircut? No. Do you see the haircuts they have? They should come, shouldn't they? But they're not coming for tax reasons. It's just one of these fallacies that people repeat all the time. Next slide, please. Now, I'm going to skip over these in the interest of time because we had those technical difficulties. So skip the slide, please. Skip the next slide, please. And go to the next slide. All right. So we can, nope, go back one. You want too many. Skip too many there, Beth. Go back one. There you go. All right. So we lost the opportunity to have a graduated rate income tax. However, we still need to generate more revenue from our income tax. If we increase the income tax by 1 percentage point from its current level of 4.95% to 5.95%, that'll generate about $3.7 billion. It's about the same amount as the fair tax would have generated. The difference is the fair tax would have generated all that money from just the richest 3% in our state. The bottom 97% would have paid less. With a flat tax, everybody pays more. So if you wanted to say, make sure that people with $50,000 a year or less in adjusted gross income didn't pay this tax increase, you'd have to offset it with a refundable tax credit targeted just to families earning that amount or less, and that would cost about $667 million. So you probably would want to do that, given that the the downturn in the economy created by COVID-19 has really harmed lower earning families much more so than top earning families. 80% of the jobs lost so far during the pandemic have actually been in the bottom 2 wage quintiles. So you'd really want to design some targeted tax relief. But on the other hand, you do need to raise that rate. We can't solve our fiscal problems in Illinois without expanding the state sales tax base to include services, consumer services, increasing the state's income tax rate at least by 1 percentage point, maybe by 1.5 points, depending on how much tax relief you want to give, and then re-amortizing our pension debt, as I discussed before. And so that's really how we've got to solve our problem. And that's why our tax policy doesn't work. Our tax policy hasn't worked for years because it just doesn't reflect the modern economy. And because it doesn't reflect the modern economy, revenue growth has not kept up with service cost growth. That's created a structural deficit. That structural deficit resulted in state decision makers pushing the primary obligation of fund schools down to local property taxes, which is why your property taxes are in fact too high. That is why we have our unfunded pension liability. It has nothing to do with the benefits. It has everything to do with years and years of intentional underfunding and writing IOUs to the system that bore interest that compounded annually. So that's where we are today. These problems are all solvable. They're not solvable unless we take an honest look at our tax policy and fix it. We take an honest look at our pension funding mechanism and re-amortize. I'm happy to entertain questions. Hearing none, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing. Okay.
Sure.
Thank you so much. Sarah, do you want to look at the questions that we have there?
Well, the one question that's there is from me. And my
Okay.
question is, what are the chances that any of these 3 fixes will actually happen?
I think this year slim and none. And the reason for that, now the pension one, there's a chance. We almost got that done in the last year of Governor Rauner. We had 15 Republicans working with us behind the scenes, and Rauner was tacitly supporting it. And because of that, we had more than like 25, 30 Democrats supporting it. And the very last second, Rauner decided for political reasons he wasn't going to support it because he wanted to use the pension underfunding as a way to hammer unions in his reelection campaign. So he pulled his support, and then we lost the Republicans that were supporting it, so we didn't get it done. That could happen this year. And there's been folks in leadership. Carol Amons is a state rep that has always supported this. Kim Lightford has always supported this. Will Davis has always supported this. So we've had Melinda Bush has always supported this. So, we've had a number of folks that have supported this over the time. So that's something that actually could happen. And it's really worth working over your legislators to say, hey, support a re-amortization of the pension debt according to, or along the lines of what CTBA proposed. It doesn't have to be exactly our proposal, right? But something like that has to happen. And I think that could happen. I think on the income and sales tax, the failure of the fair tax made even legislators that get that tax policy is flawed in Illinois, get the taxes have to be increased, that wholeheartedly supported the fair tax, saying, right now there's not an appetite in Illinois to increase taxes. And they're reading the failure of the fair tax amendment as an overall voter statement that they're not interested in tax increases. I don't think that's entirely right, but that's where the politicians are. And so what they think is far more important than what I think. So I think that'll be very difficult to move this year. I do think there's a couple of things Governor Pritzker put on the table that made sense. You mentioned, in our earlier discussion, Beth, the decoupling, at least I think it was you, Beth, but it may have been somebody else that mentioned decoupling. The federal government has changed its tax policy law, creating some tax breaks for businesses. Illinois' income taxes, corporate and individual, piggyback on the feds. So whenever the feds change their law, our law automatically changes unless we decouple. Well, we should decouple from this. Why? The federal government can deficit spend all it wants. We cannot. So we can't afford to lose the revenue. And it's not like these businesses would lose the tax break at the federal level. They would just stay in the same tax situation in Illinois they were in, status quo ante. That's meaning no change. So it's not a tax increase on them any way, shape, and form. And I think you saw, but I will reiterate, on that Ernst & Young analysis, The corporate income tax is only 4% of the taxes businesses pay in Illinois. It's a very small tax burden. It's really not something that creates any hardship for business, and keeping that tax revenue at this juncture, given how big our deficit is important. Pritzker also put on the table taking away a couple of business tax expenditures totaling up to about $900 million that are on the books that I think make a lot of sense. My organization, we call these things tax expenditures rather than tax breaks, because really you're spending through the tax code to accomplish a public good. And in this case, what you're doing is you're saying, all right, business, I would normally be able to collect, let's just put dollars on it, $10 from you in income taxes under this tax. I'm going to let you keep that $10 in public money that you should be paying to us to create a public good. And in most cases, it's job creation. You want to see businesses invest in creating jobs. Well, what the research show is that tax expenditures designed to create new jobs don't work. There's never been any statistically meaningful correlation between changes in tax policy, whether creating benefits or taking away benefits, et cetera, for businesses, and whether or not businesses actually are encouraged to hire more people or grow the economy for that matter. But now I hope all of you are sitting, because I'm going to tell you what was found. This is the Congressional Budget Office, by the way. They did find one thing that encouraged businesses to hire more people. Are you ready? Apparently, growing demand for whatever that business sells encourages them to increase their capacity to meet that demand. Who thought microeconomics actually made sense? But then if you put that in the context of tax policy, if you cut a business's taxes and there are no changes in demand for what it's selling, why should it hire more people with the money? You're putting wasted excess capacity on your payroll you don't need. That's highly inefficient. It's bad business. You shouldn't do it. And so really, there's been a misunderstanding of how tax policy does interact with the private sector. So I do think literally every one of the tax expenditures that Governor Pritzker has put on the table should be taken off the books. They aren't generating any economic value for the state. And so we need that 900 million in revenue.
There's a question about your proposing that consumer services be taxed, and isn't that unfair since everyone would be paying those?
Yeah, it's so yes, it's regressive, but it's needed from a stability standpoint. Remember, there's only two large revenue sources that feed state government, and these revenue sources have to track the modern economy. That's both of them, sales and income. Ours does not at the sales tax level because it doesn't tax the largest and fastest growing segment of the economy. And when you do that, you have a structural deficit over time. So you absolutely need to expand the sales tax base to services. Is it regressive? Yes. Is it less regressive than the current tax that just focuses on products? Yes. Here's why. Middle income family, a low income family use more of their income on products, and affluent families use more of their income on services. So the classic example, I talked about a lawnmower before. Well, the single mom in Peoria with a house, she's going to buy a lawnmower to mow her lawn, right? And she's going to pay sales tax on that. The guy that runs a hedge fund living in Barrington is going to hire a lawn service. He doesn't pay a tax on the lawn service. So, affluent people do in fact consume more services than do low and moderate income families. And that said, it's still regressive. But if it's a choice between a regressive tax and what Illinois has been doing, which is cutting spending on services in real term, and you're worried about the economic impact on a lower middle income earner, pick the regressive tax every single time is the better policy. The cut in the services is far more devastating from an economic standpoint and from a civil rights standpoint. I'll talk about education in a second. Than is the additional 25 or 50 bucks the family will have to pay in sales taxes over the course of the year. So context, what if the cut is childcare services? So now a single working mom loses her childcare services because we have to cut it because of our budget problems. That's one of the things we've been cutting, by the way. Well, the economic value to the family of that is what, $6,000, $7,000 a year? What's compared to 25, 50 bucks and more taxes? It's not close. Underfunding education? Are you kidding me? What's the long-term economic value in that? I'll tell you right now, a college grad in today's economy earns 45% more than a high school grad. So what's the economic value of this underfunded the education system to a low or moderate income family? Let's get these kids the skill sets they need K-12 to go on and credential themselves at the next level so that they have an opportunity to be competitive in a modern economy. So it's not a close call. And the other thing you could do through the income tax, I mentioned really briefly the refundable credit for offsetting an income tax increase. Well, the great thing about a refundable income tax credit, like the earned income tax credit, is you get the full value of that credit, even if it exceeds your income tax liability. So let's say you qualify, you're a low to low middle income worker, you qualify for a $100 earned income tax credit, but you only owe the state $50 in income taxes. Obviously, you don't have to pay the $50. And then there's $50 more in the credit you get a check for. And what that effectively does is it offsets other taxes you pay, sales, excise, and property. So you could use refundable tax credits through your income tax to offset some of this additional tax liability on low and moderate income families.
Is there any chance for a redo on fair tax? You're being asked.
Let me think about it. No. Do you want me to think about it some more? No.
By what, so a little bit more information on fair tax, by what proportion did it fail?
Huge. So we needed 65% of the vote and it got like 46, 48%. So didn't come close.
There's the point is being made that we did a terrible job explaining it. And so maybe if it was explained better and put back before the taxpayers, it would have a better chance.
The answer to that is to explain it takes some time and takes disabusing people of their preconceived notions that the state of Illinois overtaxes already, that this is a slippery slope that's going to lead to higher taxes on them. These are all the arguments used by the anti-fair tax crowd. And they're very effective because they really play to people's preconceived notions. And so in a political process, it's very difficult to get the kind of messaging out that really counters the preconceived notions plus builds the case. And so I agree that they could have done a better job. I think one of the things that they should have done that wasn't done was tying the tax increase that would have been paid by the richest 3% in Illinois to the services it would have funded. That's always an effective thing to do, and that really wasn't part of the campaign. I keep talking about this master's course I teach, but the second chapter of the book I use is called The Politics of Revenue. And believe it or not, tax policy is pretty politically impacted. And they basically say, you can't get a major tax increase unless you sell the taxpayers on how you're going to spend the money and the importance of the new revenue force funding these purposes. And that really was missing from the campaign. So that could have been done better, but I still think they would have lost.
And someone wants to know what the toughest question or challenge have you heard to your view of Illinois' tax situation? How do you respond to it? What's the pushback?
I don't find any of them tough because all the questions, and I'm just being honest, that's because I'm a nerd. So let me be clear. All the questions I get are based on ideology and they fall apart when they're analyzed under the data. So all the questions I get, will people run screaming out of the state migrating? No, here's the data on that. And this is, you're going to scare millionaires away, it'll destroy our economy. No, here's the data on that. So no matter what the argument was that was raised against a fair tax, I felt very comfortable responding to it because literally all the data supported the fair tax and none of it supported the other side. But so in my mind, they weren't hard. And now I think you want to know what I thought was most effective. I think, raising taxes during a recession is a bad idea. You're going to hurt the economy. Very effective. A lot of people bought that. This is a slippery slope to taxing retirement income. It's going to make it easier to tax retirement income. No, it's not. And here's all the reasons, blah, blah, blah. But very effective argument. People are afraid of that, right? And I think the migration thing really did get to a lot of people that, Illinois is already losing all these people, and it's all because of taxes. And if we raise taxes in any way, we're going to not only lose people, now we're going to lose our wealthy people. We can't afford to lose them. None of that is supportable with any of the data. But I think those were the most effective arguments used by the other side that really played on biases and preconceived notions effectively.
Thank you. Someone wants to know if taxes on marijuana and the lottery weren't they supposed to help?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite.
The taxes on marijuana and the lottery. were
Yeah.
supposed to help.
You're great. Go get them. They're nothing. They're rounding errors. They don't raise a lot of money. So one reason I focused this presentation on the sales and income tax is because those are the big taxes. If those aren't right, all these little things around, I mean, what's the marijuana tax raising? $400 million? Got a $41 billion budget. You kidding me? What's the lottery raise? $600 million. You got a $42 billion budget. We need that budget to be 48, 50 billion. You're not going to get there through marijuana. You're not going to get there through the lottery. You're not going to get there through any creative revenue idea. You got to have your basic taxes work in the modern economy. Ours do not. Our income tax doesn't generate enough revenue because it doesn't focus the tax burden on where all the growth in the economy is going, to the top 3 or 4%, because we don't have a graduated rate structure. Our sales tax doesn't work because it doesn't really hit the one segment of our private sector economy that's not just largest, but fastest growing. That doesn't work. We got to fix our tax policy to somehow work in the modern economy. And if we don't fix the big taxes, we can't solve it with these other little things.
Okay. Merle is asking, why is it considered diminishment if the automatic 3% cost of living raise is changed to reflect actual cost of living increase? We've had years and years with no increase in cost of living, yet Illinois adds 3% to every teacher's pension.
Well, why is it considered? I'm guessing this is a constitutional question under the Constitution, and the answer is very simple. The language in the Constitution is that the benefits promised to an employee, a public sector employee, the day they are hired, cannot be diminished or impaired. So if the day they were hired, they got a 3% compounding COLA, that's what they get. They can't get anything less than that the rest of their career. You could always change that for new hires, which they did, by the way, in 2010. So now the majority of state workers don't get this 3% compounding COLA, but that's why it's considered a diminishment. And, it's funny, if you read the language, I was the only commentator, I'm going to take a little credit here, the only commentator that said when Senator John Colleton put in SB1 that cut the COLA and did all these other things, that said it was going to be ruled unconstitutional because, number one, the clear language of the Constitution made it such that you didn't have to get into any interpretation. I said the Illinois Supreme Court's going to read that language and say, it's clear, that's a diminishment, this is unconstitutional. But if they read the constitutional history for the lawyers in the group, legal construction, whether it's of a law or a statute or a constitution, look at the history of its development if there's any ambiguity, right? The woman who drafted this clause, and I forget her name, she was a state rep, said, we're putting this clause in the Constitution to stop state and local governments from intentionally underfunding the pensions for budgetary reasons. And then down the road saying, now we got to cut your benefits because we've run out of money. I mean, literally anticipating exactly what they did. So yeah, no, you can't. And really, the unfunded liability is not a result of this benefit, nor of the 3% compounding COLA. I'll point out, when the 3% compounding COLA became law, it was deemed a concession by the unions because inflation at the time, we were 7, 8, 9%. And so the unions actually had to get other concessions to agree to the 3% compounding. Management thought it was getting a killing. And this just shows you how you can't really peg a percentage into something like a COLA. You should always tie it to inflation. And maybe if you're having really bad inflation, say inflation, if it gets above a certain point, minus whatever, or cap it at a point. But really, to put a specific amount in, it was viewed as a deal when it was signed, And it became a bad deal for management, you know, a few years later, like 10 years later.
Karen Fresco is suggesting that it seems to her that we need to harness the efforts of the League of Women Voters and other like-minded organizations, and strategize a campaign over the next couple of years to educate the voters, marshal the data and arguments.
Sounds good to me.
Sounds reasonable, I was going to say.
That's what we're doing.
Frederica is asking which states are taxing properly. I'm sorry, I thought it said property. Which states are taxing properly?
You know, Minnesota has a pretty sound tax system. They bumped up their graduated rate structure to impose a special millionaires tax a few years ago, and they've been pretty fiscally responsible. A state like, I'm trying to think, on the Northeast, there's a few states that get it right. I mean, the bottom line is what you need to do is design a tax system that meets your state's economy around the principles of sound tax policy. And Illinois hasn't done that.
Thank you. And then Elena is just asking you one more time the organization that you are representing, that you work for.
Okay, so I am the executive director of the Center for Tact and Budget Accountability, ctbaonline.org. You can go to our website and see a bunch of our stuff. And I also am the Rubloff Professor of Public Policy at Roosevelt University.
Thank you very much. Those are the questions in the chat.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, when I send the follow-up, I'll send you all this information. And Ralph, you'll give us the name of your course too. So
Sure.
you can look into it. That would be great. This is just what I expected, a real clarification of what's wrong here and what we can do and what we should be doing, which obviously are pretty far apart right now. But now we know which holes to put our fingers in to plug which flooding that we're doing. I'm gonna cut in here just a minute to talk about our next programs. April 25th, we're doing a April 26th, third program on climate change. In May, we're having reproductive maternal health. And I think we have a very special speaker lined up, but we won't know for sure and we'll let you know. Ralph, thank you so much. I think everyone has, just the questions that you've seen showed a good understanding for what you're sharing with us. And we truly appreciate your time
Thanks for having
tailoring
me.
this to us.
Always happy
this is
to be
terrific.
invited. Hey, I do tax policy for a living. I'm pretty happy to be invited anywhere, but I'm really happy to be invited to a group of people who really care about the state and trying to figure out things and get them right from a policy standpoint. So thanks for having me. Take care.
Okay. Thank you so much. Good night, everyone. See you next month. Happy holiday, whichever. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah. Add a few more comments here. So for those skeptics of you, when I said we're going to have Ralph Martiri, I hope it was worthwhile. So I'm going to stop the recording.